Are they really this miracle molecule? Social media has created absolute chaos. Are we getting better at treating disease, or are we getting better at managing it? Welcome back to another episode of the Get Buff with Reets podcast, where we break down the science behind fitness, nutrition, hormones, and mindset to help you make formed decisions about your own fitness and health performance. I'm Reets, and today we are diving into one of the most controversial and popular topics on social media when it comes to health and fitness. Peptides. Over the last couple of years, peptides have definitely exploded all over everyone's feeds. You'll open Instagram or you'll open TikTok and somebody is discussing their stack and biohacking. Influencers are documenting their protocols. Celebrities and athletes are doing interviews about the latest peptides that have helped them recover or have increased their performance. People are now openly talking about taking them. And more people are asking, is this some sort of secret? What is the science behind peptides and why have they suddenly become so popular? Are they really the secret behind these online transformations that we're seeing? We're here to ask the question, are they really this miracle molecule that everyone suggests that they are? Or are they simply the latest trend to take over the fitness industry, a fad, something we've seen before? In an industry that absolutely loves the promise of a shortcut. Before we do get into today's episode, I really want to make something clear. I am not a doctor. This isn't medical advice. And I do not prescribe or recommend peptides to any of my coaching clients. My role is to help people build stronger, healthier bodies through training, nutrition, and sustainable lifestyle habits. The purpose of today's episode isn't to tell you what you should or shouldn't take. It's to help you understand what peptides actually are, what the current evidence says, where they do have legitimate medical use, and where the research is still developing, and why so much conversation on social media lacks important context. My goal is simply to give you the information you need to critically think and make an informed decision in partnership where you see fit with a medical professional. So let's get into it. What actually are peptides? Let's start with the absolute basics, because I think a lot of confusion comes from the fact that the word peptide gets thrown around referring to one specific thing. In reality, a peptide isn't a single drug, nor is it a single compound. It's actually a broad category of molecules. A peptide is simply a chain of amino acids. Amino acids are often referred to as the building blocks of protein. And when a small number of them join together, they can form a peptide. Longer chains then become proteins. Here's the most important part that people miss. Peptides already exist inside your body. They are naturally occurring. Your body is already producing them every single day. They're involved in almost every single system that we have in our body. So they act as chemical messengers, carrying signals from one cell and telling your body what to do. We have peptides that regulate our appetite. Others influence hormone production. Some help us control our blood sugar. Others are involved in tissue repair, inflammation, digestion, sleep, recovery, and even muscle growth. So despite the way that social media talks about peptides, they're not some brand new miracle invention. It's not something that scientists have created. It's something that already exists in our bodies. Your body relies on them for normal, everyday function. Now, what has changed is that manufacturers have learned how to manufacture certain peptides to use them therapeutically. Some, very few, are now licensed for use to treat conditions like type 2 diabetes while others are still very experimental and are only being studied in clinical research. And that's where things start to get a little bit murky and confusing. When people online say they're taking peptides, they could be talking about dozens of completely different compounds. And each one of these compounds does something completely different. Some are designed to help regulate your appetite, some to stimulate your growth hormone release. Others are being investigated to lower inflammation and help with tissue healing. And many are still being researched with very limited human research, with limited human evidence. So, before we can talk about whether peptides are effective, safe, or even worth considering, we first need to understand that all peptides aren't equal. They're not one product and they're not one medication. They're a family of compounds, each with its own different purpose. And that's exactly what we're going to go into and break down next. Why is everybody suddenly talking about peptides? So, if peptides have always existed, why does it feel like they have blown up and suddenly they are appearing everywhere? And the short answer is they haven't. What's changed is the conversation around them. Over the last few years, social media has played a huge role in bringing peptides to the forefront. So, what was a topic that was mostly discussed in clinical research, athlete circles, bodybuilding circles, anti aging clinics is now plastered all over TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. You'll see different influencers sharing their stacks, creators documenting their results week by week, podcasts like this discussing the latest compound, and even celebrities and professional athletes openly talking about what peptides have helped their journey. Now, at the same time, peptide research is also developing. Scientists are investigating their potential in areas such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, muscle wasting, age related diseases, and wound healing. Some peptide based medications have become established treatments with strong evidence, while many others are still experimental and are continuing to be studied. The problem is that social media doesn't differentiate between these. It often presents these compounds as they're all the same thing. A peptide that's been prescribed by a doctor is very different from a experimental peptide being sold online as a research chemical. Yet they are so frequently discussed in the same breath, making it difficult for people to establish what's medicine and what's early stage research. That's why you'll hear people talk about peptides as if they're one miracle solution. In reality, there isn't one peptide. There are dozens of peptides that all act on different pathways, with very different levels of scientific research behind them. So, before we can have an informed decision about whether peptides are effective, we first need to understand the very different categories that exist. The different categories of peptides. So now we know what peptides are and why they've become such a hot topic. Let's look at the different categories. Because one of the biggest misconceptions that I see online when people are talking about peptides is as though they are all the same. They're not. Think of the word peptide as one car, a family hatchback, if you will. A Ferrari, a delivery van are all cars, but they're all built for completely different purposes. Peptides are no different. They're all short chains of amino acids, but each one has a different function within the body. Broadly speaking, there are several categories that you'll hear about. First, we have our metabolic peptides. These influence things like appetite, blood sugar, and energy balance. This is where GLP-1 medications such as semaglutide and tirzepatide sit, and they're probably the peptides that most people have heard of and don't realize are peptides. Then we have the growth hormone peptides, CJC1295, ipamorelin, ceramorelin. Rather than actually containing growth hormone, they're designed to help simulate your body's own growth hormone response or amplify the response. Next, we have healing peptides. These are names like BP157, TB-500, and KPV. These are often discussed for their potential role in tissue repair, inflammation reduction, and recovery. Although the strength of evidence varies consistently depending on the compound. You also have immune peptides, which researchers are investigating for their role and their effects on inflammation and immune function. Then we have cosmetic peptides, such as GHKCU, which are being explored for collagen production, wound healing, and also skin health. You'll also hear about sexual health peptides, tanning peptides, and an emerging group of performance and mitochondrial peptides, being researched for areas such as energy production, health, and anti-aging and metabolic disease. The important thing to remember is that all of these peptides have different functions. They belong in completely different categories. Someone saying they're taking peptides tells you very little. The more important question is always which peptide, for what purpose, and what's the quality of evidence behind this compound. For today's episode, I'm mainly going to focus on metabolic peptides, healing peptides, and also cosmetic peptides. I may do a second version to cover more, but these are the three that most women have heard of and are exploring. Let's start with GLP-1s. This is the peptide that everybody already knows, but very few people realize that it is a peptide. Medications such as Ozempic, semaglutide, Wegovy, Mounjaro, which are tirzepatide, and now an investigational drug called retatrutide, have completely changed the conversation around obesity and metabolic health. GLP-1 stands for glycogen-like peptide 1, which is a hormone our bodies naturally produce after we eat. It helps you regulate your blood sugar, slows the rate at which food is digested in your stomach, and also sends signals to your brain that it's full. Semaglutide works by mimicking that natural hormone. Now, tirzepatide takes things a little bit further by acting both on that GLP-1 pathway and receptor as well as the GIP receptor. This is another hormone that's involved in blood sugar regulation and metabolism. Now, retatrutide is even more interesting. It's known as a triple antagonist because it targets 3 different receptors, all at the same time: the GLP-1, the GIP, and the glucagon. Early clinical trials have shown extremely promising evidence and results for weight loss and metabolic health. Although it's still being investigated and hasn't yet been approved for clinical use, the signs are that this will happen in the next 12 to 18 months. This progression gives us a fascinating glimpse into where metabolic medicine may be heading over the next decade. And I think it's really important to understand that this field isn't standing still. We're already seeing the next generation of metabolic peptides being developed, like retatrutide, with researchers really focusing on improving weight loss, metabolic health, and potentially other obesity-related diseases. Now, if you've listened to my previous podcast where I discuss Serena Williams publicly speaking about GLP-1 medications, you'll know that my view really hasn't changed. I think GLP-1 medications are one of the most significant advancements we've seen in metabolic medicine in years. For people living with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and certain metabolic conditions, these medications can genuinely be life-changing. They don't just help with weight loss, they can improve blood sugar control, reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, and for many people, significantly improve their life quality. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Sometimes in the fitness industry, we do become very anti medication to the extent that we ignore the science. And that's not my position. I am pro science. However, I do still agree for the woman that just wants to lose 5 to 10 pounds, abusing these medications isn't the right move. And that's what the majority of people are doing. They're going about it in the wrong way. But let's go back to the science. If we have a treatment that's been through rigorous clinical trials, has demonstrated meaningful benefits, and can improve someone's health and overall life quality, that's definitely something that's worth celebrating. What I will acknowledge is we still don't know what the long-term effects are. However, they have been deemed safe enough to use. What they do not do is replace the nutrition. They don't replace resistance training. They don't replace building sustainable habits. And that is where my concern begins. It's not necessarily with the medication itself, but it's with the way that it's being used and often the way it's portrayed online. You only have to do a quick search on TikTok to see women showing their everyday diet on GLP-1s. And often it's, oh, I still got a cheeky takeaway, but I just ate less. One of the biggest concerns during rapid weight loss is the loss of lean muscle mass. The majority of people don't have enough muscle mass as it is. And when I say they don't have enough muscle mass, I mean they don't have as much muscle mass as they'd benefit from for their long-term health. Muscle isn't just about looking toned and appearance. It's one of the biggest predictors of healthy aging. It supports strength, mobility, metabolic health, bone density, and independence later in life. So, if someone is losing weight quickly without eating enough protein and not doing enough resistance training or doing any resistance training, losing muscle becomes a genuine concern. If you have been prescribed a GLP-1 drug, I would want resistance training and adequate protein intake to become a non-negotiable. I'd want the focus to be on preserving as much lean muscle mass as possible while improving overall health. Because eventually we have to ask an important question. What happens when the medication stops? If the only thing that has changed is your appetite, but your relationship with food, your daily habits, your training, and your lifestyle haven't changed, managing that progress becomes near impossible. For me, that's where coaching and medicine really need to start working together, not against each other as opposing views. Medicine can really help address the biology. Coaching can help address the behaviors. And when those things work together, that's often where you'll see the best long-term outcomes. I also think it's so important to realize how quickly this field is moving. We've gone from semaglutide to tirzepatide, and now we're seeing drugs like retatrutide in late-stage clinical development. By targeting these different hormonal pathways, GLP-1, GIP, glucagon, it has shown some incredibly promising results in clinical trials. Personally, I think we're only at the beginning of metabolic medicine in this decade. Being excited about the future doesn't mean we shouldn't ask the important and hard scientific questions. These are still relatively new therapies, and we need long-term data to understand what years or even decades of this treatment might look like. And that's why I always come back to the same position. I'm excited by the science, but I'm also cautious of the hype. PCOS, insulin resistance, and metabolic health. Now, I'm going to acknowledge very quickly that PCOS's name is being challenged at the moment to be PMOS, but currently, as it stands, it is called PCOS, so that's what I'll refer to it as. This feels like a really good point to talk about PCOS because it's a condition that affects such a huge number of women, and it's often so oversimplified online. One of the key features of PCOS is insulin resistance. Now, not every single woman with PCOS has insulin resistance, and not every single person will experience the condition in the exact same way. But for a significant proportion of women, insulin plays a major role. When your body becomes less sensitive to insulin, it has to produce more of it to keep blood sugar under control. Over a longer period of time, higher insulin levels can contribute to increased fat storage, make weight loss more difficult for some individuals, and influence hormone production, including increasing androgen levels, which are responsible for symptoms such as acne, excessive hair growth, and irregular menstrual cycles. This is one of the reasons GLP-1 medications have generated so much interest in women with PCOS. By improving the insulin sensitivity, regulating appetite, and supporting weight loss where appropriate, they have the potential to improve several aspects of the condition, not just body weight. We're also starting to see that researchers are now accepting and increasingly recognizing that PCOS isn't simply a reproductive condition. For many women, it's also a metabolic condition, hence the discussion around the name PMOS. That doesn't mean the official medical definition has changed yet, but our understanding of PCOS continues to evolve as more research emerges. Again, this comes back to something that I've said throughout this episode. These medications aren't simply about being thinner. For the right patient, they're treating an underlying metabolic dysfunction. And I think that's such an important distinction to make. Because when you understand why a medication works, you stop viewing it as a shortcut and start seeing it as a tool within the bigger picture of health. Lifestyle still matters. Nutrition still matters. Resistance training still matters. Sleep, stress management, and overall metabolic health still matter. But this medication can support those things. It doesn't replace them. Let's talk about JHKCU, the cosmetic, or as social media refers to it, pretty peptide. Not every single peptide is designed for weight loss or muscle growth. One that's become increasingly popular over the last few years, GHKCU, also known as the copper peptide. Unlike GLP-1 medications, GHKCU is being researched primarily for its potential in skin health, tissue repair, and also wound healing. Interestingly, this isn't a synthetic molecule that was invented in a laboratory. GHKCU actually occurs naturally in the human body. It's a very small peptide that binds to copper and appears to play a very big role in tissue repair and regeneration. So as we age, GHKCU does decline in our bodies, which is one of the reasons that researchers became interested in it to see whether replacing it could have therapeutic benefits. Today, you'll find copper peptide in everything from anti-aging creams and products to hair growth treatments. There are some studies that suggest that it can help stimulate collagen production, improve wound healing, and support skin repair. And there is some promising research in those areas. However, like many peptides we've discussed today, it's important not to overstate the evidence. Some of the claims online are much stronger than what the research evidence actually supports. Does it have potential? Absolutely. But do we have the evidence for every anti-aging claim at this point? Not yet. And that's a theme that you're going to see throughout this episode. Being excited about a therapy isn't the same as proving it works for every claim attached to it. Tanning peptides are the other peptides that are becoming increasingly popular online, particularly melanotan 1 and melanotan 2. These work very differently to GLP-1 medications or healing peptides. Instead of affecting your appetite or tissue repair, they act on receptors involved in production of melanin, which is obviously the pigment that gives our skin, hair, and eye color the color they have. The idea is that by increasing melanin production, people can develop a darker tan with less exposure to UV light. That sounds appealing to some people on the surface, but it's really important to understand the concerns that come with these compounds. Melanotan 1 has been used for studies. Now, melatonin 1 has actually been scientifically researched for certain conditions. Melanotan 2 has never been approved for cosmetic tanning and is commonly sold through unregulated online suppliers. Like many research peptides, there's lots of questions around the quality, the dosing, the long-term safety, and also the side effects. People have reported nausea, facial flushing, changes in libido, darkening of existing moles and freckles, which is one of the reasons healthcare professionals really advise caution. I think this particular peptide really does show how social media can really blur the lines between legitimate medical research and cosmetic experimentation. Just because something is popular online doesn't automatically make it safe, well studied, or appropriate for everyone. In my opinion, this peptide's controversial in itself. Social media has created absolute chaos. And now I want to really move away from the science and talk about what the actual biggest problem is. And it isn't the peptides, it's social media. If you spend 5 minutes on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube, you'll probably come across someone sharing their stack. They're taking a GLP-1, BPC 157, TB-500, CJC 1295, ipamorelin, tesamorelin, testosterone, sometimes 6 or 7 different compounds at a time. Then in a few weeks, they'll post a transformation and say, "This peptide changed my life." And my first thought always is, how do you know? If you've changed your nutrition, started training harder, improved your sleep, increased your steps, and introduced all of these 6 or 7 compounds at once, how could you possibly know which one or which ones possibly made the difference? And equally, if something goes wrong, how do you know which compound is causing the side effect or which cocktail of compounds are causing the side effect? You don't. One of the most important principles of science is isolation of the variables. You need to be able to isolate each variable so you can test and you know the result of each. If you change everything at once, you're never going to know what the causation is. Therefore, you don't learn very much. In fact, one of my favorite sayings is, if you're changing everything at once, you're learning nothing. And I do think there is this culture on social media around peptides where it's like a Pokemon and you have to collect them all. Every month, there's a new miracle peptide, a new protocol, a new stack, a new game changer. But medicine doesn't work like that. Your body isn't a science experiment for TikTok content. The goal shouldn't be to take the most amount of compounds. It should be to use the least amount of intervention to get the desired result. And I think that distinction has really been lost online. And the other thing I rarely see people talk about when it comes to peptides is talking about blood work. If you're experimenting with compounds that are influencing things like your hormones, your metabolism, your recovery, how many people are actually getting baseline blood tests before they start? And how many are then repeating that blood work to objectively see what's changed. Because if you're not measuring anything, how do you know whether the marker has improved, stayed the same, or even moved in the wrong direction? Without baseline data, you're relying entirely on how you feel. And I'm not saying that's not a good measure, but I'm saying that's an incomplete picture. Let's talk about the transformation problem. This leads perfectly into something else that I am consistently seeing: transformation videos. We love them, but someone loses 30 kilos, 20 kilos, 10 kilos, whatever it is. Someone gets absolutely shredded to the bone. Someone builds an insane physique. And immediately the comment section is filled with, what peptide are you taking? What's your stack? Where did you buy it? But here's the thing: physiques are never, ever, ever built on just one thing. Particularly when we look at some of the drastic male transformations that are dominating, I want to say, TikTok at the moment. That person may be on testosterone replacement therapy because they've been diagnosed with low testosterone. They might be taking additional testosterone to build muscle. They might be using a GLP-1 medication during a fat loss phase. They may be taking additional peptides. They may be taking anabolic steroids or other performing enhancing drugs. On top of that, they're probably following a really structured nutrition and training plan. They're resistance training consistently. They're prioritizing sleep, and their recovery is priority number one. Yet somehow, that entire transformation is going to be credited to a single peptide. That's incredibly misleading. And I'm not saying every single individual is taking that long list of things, but they are most likely working with a combination. But the person watching thinks, if I buy that vial, I'll look like that too. When in reality, what they're actually seeing is multiple interventions, months or years of consistency, and other factors that were probably never disclosed. This is why context matters. The transformation might be real, but the explanation behind it is usually incomplete. Let's talk about provenance. Do you actually know what's in that vial? Even if we put the effectiveness completely to one side, there's another question that does not get asked nearly enough. Where did the peptide come from? There's a big difference between a pharmaceutical grade medication that's manufactured under strict controls and a vial that's brought online that's labeled research use only and is imported from China. For example, you'll often see things like phrases such as laboratory grade, research chemical, not for human consumption. Those labels should make you stop and think. Who manufactured it? Has it been independently tested? Is the concentration accurate? Was it produced under sterile conditions? Because the reality is, the majority of peptides that are sold online exist in a regulatory grey area. Some suppliers might have excellent quality control, others might not. And unless products are independently tested, the average consumer has no way of really knowing what's inside that vial. That's why provenance matters. Not because peptides themselves are inherently dangerous, but because the quality matters. A medication that's produced under strict pharmaceutical standards is very different from an unregulated product purchased from an unknown source. So, before anyone thinks about whether peptides work, I'd first ask a much simpler question. Do I know what I'm injecting? For me, that's a really big conversation that is missing from social media. I have seen it in the Reddit threads, but much less on the Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Why I became interested in peptides. Up until now, I've kept this episode as objective as possible. We've talked about the science, the different types of peptides, the evidence, where the evidence is strong, where it isn't, and why I think social media has caused so much confusion around the topic. But I also think it's important for me to explain why this topic became so interesting to me personally. because this isn't something I just stumbled upon on TikTok. It's something that became relevant for me for my own health. I've lived with Crohn's disease since I was 7 years old. If you're not familiar with Crohn's, it's a chronic inflammatory bowel disease where the immune system attacks itself. In particular, it attacks parts of your digestive tract, causing ongoing inflammation, ulceration. It can affect everything from nutrient absorption, energy levels, to pain, weight, surgery, hospital admissions, and day-to-day quality of life. Crohn's disease can often be so severe that it is classed as a disability. Growing up, hospital became a very normal part of life for me. Consultants, scans, blood tests, medications, being podded and poked, periods where things did improve and periods where they didn't. You'll also know, if you followed my journey, I had my gallbladder removed last year. That was also a result of having Crohn's disease and it not functioning properly. When you have lived with a chronic disease for that long, in my mind, all my life, for as long as I can remember, your relationship with medicine does change because you genuinely become interested in understanding what's happening inside your body, and you read the research papers, you ask the questions, you want to understand why treatments work and how. I've been really fortunate that modern medicine does keep evolving with my Crohn's disease. For my particular circumstances, for some reason, my body likes to be allergic to new medications. And as quick as new medications have become available, I very quickly, my body no longer tolerates them, they no longer work for me, or I'm allergic. And touch wood, so far in my case, there's been the next generation of medications that have been released each time. The biologic medication that I am prescribed on at the moment is life-changing for me. It means I got my life back. And I am so incredibly grateful that that treatment exists, because without those advancements, my quality of life would be very different. And I think that's a really important point to make. Some conversations online become medical versus natural health. I don't see it like that. I don't think it necessarily has to be one or the other. They're not competing ideas, they're complementary. So, when I started hearing more discussions about peptides, I had a genuine interest, particularly when I saw that there were compounds that were specifically being researched for a disease called colitis, which is very similar to Crohn's. It's not as extreme. It's the same inflammation, ulceration, however, it's limited to the large bowel. So when I see these compounds being researched for tissue repair, inflammation, gut health, I was curious. Not because I was looking for a miracle cure, I was already on medication, and not because I thought someone on social media has discovered some sort of miracle, something that doctors had somehow missed. But because when you have a lifelong inflammatory condition, you pay attention to the emerging research. You want to know what's being investigated, how successful or promising it's looking, and you want to know what future treatments could look like. There is nothing wrong with that curiosity. I'd even argue that it's completely understandable. One thing that living with Crohn's has taught me is that science never stands still. The treatment options today are dramatically different to the ones that existed when I was diagnosed as a child. When I was diagnosed, there were probably two main drugs that were used, and then steroid therapy, which did not work for me but made me really ill. Biological therapies have transformed so many people's lives. Not just people with inflammatory bowel disease, but people with other chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. The research just continues to evolve. And that's one of the reasons I think I have such an optimistic mindset when it does come to this. Not because I think we found all the answers, quite the opposite. I think there's so much we need to understand, but it's that we understand a little bit more now than we did the previous year. And that's probably why I enjoy talking about the science so much. I find it fascinating to watch our understanding evolve. But it's also why I have these discussions with caution. I also think that it's important that we don't get carried away with headlines or social media. Being interested in emerging therapies means you need to ask the right questions, not automatically assume this is great, wow, amazing. You need to stop and think and critically be able to assess the situation. Curiosity and skepticism need to exist at the same time. So, when I talk about peptides, I'm not someone that's talking about the next trend. I'm talking as someone who spent over 2 decades living with a chronic inflammatory disease who's benefited enormously from evidence based medicine and who's genuinely excited to see where the future could take us. And that perspective is probably why this topic means so much more to me than just another fitness trend. Because for me, it's not about getting leaner or building more muscle, it's the future of medicine. It's about whether one day we can treat a disease earlier, or we can find a cure to something that we didn't have before, or that we can reduce the side effects of the earlier generation medications. Whether peptides become a part of the future is to be seen, but I definitely think they're worth watching, and that's what made me make this episode. My experience with BPC157, KPV, and TB-500. So, naturally, when I started reading more about peptides being researched for healing and inflammation, three names kept coming up: BPC157, KPV, TB-500. Each one of those compounds works differently. So BPC157 is a synthetic peptide. It's been studied for its potential role in tissue repair and healing, but what makes it important for me is it's been researched particularly within the gastrointestinal tract. Although research has explored effects on tendons, ligaments, and other soft tissues, KPV is a much smaller peptide. It's derived from alpha MSH. It's attracted attention because of its potential anti inflammatory effects, particularly in inflammatory bowel disease and gut inflammation. It's being studied at the moment for colitis. And then there's TB500, which is a synthetic fragment based on thiomycin beta 4, naturally occurring protein involved in wound healing and tissue repair. Researchers believe it may support processes like cell migration, blood vessel formation, and recovery after injury, which is why it became so popular among athletes, bodybuilders, recovering from muscle, tendon, and soft tissue injuries. Now, before I go any further, I want to make something very clear. This is not me recommending peptides. This isn't me telling you to go out and go buy them. And this certainly isn't medical advice. It's simply sharing my own experience because I think it's important to separate personal experience from scientific evidence. At the time, my Crohn's disease was already being managed by biologic medication. I was not looking to replace my treatment. I wasn't trying to avoid conventional medicine. Modern medicine had already given me my life back. My curiosity was whether these peptides could provide any additional benefits to the treatment that I was already receiving. So I decided to try them. Over time, I personally noticed improvements in the way I felt. Did they cure my Crohn's? No, it's incurable. Am I claiming they put me into remission? Absolutely not, because I was already in remission. My biologic medication remains the cornerstone of my treatment, and I have no intentions of stopping it. But I did personally feel there were benefits while using them. When I eventually stopped taking them, I felt as though those benefits gradually disappeared. Again, simply my own observation. I can't prove that those changes were made or caused by the peptides. There could have been other factors involved. And that's the exact point I've made throughout this episode. Personal experience can generate questions. It can't answer them. Just because I personally experienced something doesn't mean everyone else will. It doesn't replace well designed clinical trials, and it doesn't outweigh years of scientific research. And it certainly doesn't mean that treatment works for every single person with Crohn's disease. That's why I would love to see more high quality human research into peptides like BPC 157, KPV, and TB-500. Not because I already know the answer, but because I don't. If these peptides genuinely have therapeutic potential, I want to see that demonstrated through rigorous, well controlled clinical studies. That's how science moves forward, not through viral TikTok videos, not through testimonials, but through hardcore evidence. Why does gut health matter? So, one of the biggest things living with Crohn's disease has taught me is that your gut affects so much more than just your digestion. When most people think about gut health, they're thinking about bloating, stomach aches, or whether they use the bathroom regularly. But your gut is involved in so much more than that. It's responsible for absorbing the nutrients you eat. It's home to trillions of microorganisms that make up your gut microbiome. A huge proportion of your immune system is associated with your gastrointestinal tract. And when your gut isn't functioning properly, the effects are felt in your entire body. You can struggle with energy because you're not absorbing efficiently. You may find your recovery is poorer. Inflammation can increase. Your quality of life can suffer. Living with Crohn's has really made me appreciate how interconnected our bodies really are. When your gut is inflamed, it doesn't just stay in your gut. It affects how you feel physically, emotionally, and mentally. That's one of the reasons I find this area of medicine so fascinating. If we can better understand how to reduce inflammation, support tissue repair, and improve gut function, the benefits could extend far beyond simply improving someone's digestion. Now, I also do think social media has gone too far in the other direction. Everything is suddenly blamed on poor gut health. Every symptom is apparently solved by sorting your gut out, healing your gut. The reality is so much more nuanced than that. Not every single health problem starts in your gut. And not everyone needs an extensive, expensive supplement protocol or a cupboard full of powders and greens. I do think most people would benefit from paying more attention to their gut health and the foundations of gut health. Eating a varied, fiber rich diet where appropriate, getting enough protein, managing your stress, sleeping well, exercising regularly. And if you have ongoing digestive symptoms, seeking proper medical advice rather than just treating the symptom and relying on advice that you saw on social media. For people living with inflammatory bowel disease, conditions like Crohn's disease, colitis, ulcerative colitis, or other gastrointestinal disorders, gut health isn't just about feeling less bloated or feeling a little less bloated. It's about preserving your quality of life. It's about reducing inflammation. It's about giving your body the best possible chance to function well. And that's why this area of research is so exciting. Not because I think peptides are the answer to everything, but because I think anything that genuinely helps us understand, protect, and improve gut health has the potential to impact countless lives. Why bodybuilding fell in love with peptides. If you've been in the bodybuilding world for any length of time, peptides won't feel like something new. Long before they were trending on TikTok, bodybuilders and performance athletes were already talking about compounds like BPC 157, TB 500, growth hormone secretagogues, and IGF related principles and IGF related peptides. Why? Because bodybuilding is a sport where recovery is absolutely everything. The faster you recover, the more consistently you can train. The more consistently you can train, the more muscle you build over time. For competitors, missing weeks of training because of a tendon injury or a muscle strain can have a huge impact on an entire season. So it's no surprise that these athletes have always been interested in anything that might improve recovery or rehabilitation. But it's not just bodybuilding. Across elite sport, athletes are consistently looking for ways to optimize performance, improve recovery, and reduce time away from training and give themselves every single possible advantage. That's one of the reasons why peptides have become such a huge topic over the last decade. We've also seen actors, celebrities, and professional athletes openly discussing GLP-1 medications and also peptides like BPC 157 and TB-500, bringing conversations that were once limited to specialist circles into the mainstream. But this is where context really matters. An elite athlete preparing for the Olympics, a professional bodybuilder preparing for Mr. Olympia, and someone who simply wants to lose a stone and feel healthier, they're trying to achieve completely different things. Their goals are different, their tolerance for risk will also be different. Many of these athletes, celebrities, and individuals have access to some of the best medical teams, regular blood work, and close monitoring that the average person just simply doesn't. So while everybody is interested in learning what these elite performers are doing, it doesn't automatically mean that those same approaches are appropriate for everyone else. That's a distinction social media often forgets. Treating the disease or managing it is often a question I find myself thinking about more and more in this. Are we getting better at treating disease, or are we getting better at managing it? As someone living with a chronic condition, I genuinely appreciate modern medicine. Without biologic medicine, my life would look so different today. They've allowed me to live a life that years ago simply just wouldn't have been possible. But biologics don't cure Crohn's disease, they control it. That's a really important distinction to make. And that's why research into new therapies still continues. Not because treatments have necessarily failed, but because medicine is always trying to do better. They manage it, and that got me thinking. If a peptide shows incredible promise for repairing tissue or fundamentally changing the course of a disease, who would actually pay for the huge clinical trials needed to prove it? Bringing a new medicine to market can cost hundreds of millions or even billions in some cases. Once you account for the years of research, clinical trials, and the many compounds that will fail along the way, that's a massive financial risk. So companies understandably have to believe there is a realistic chance that they will recoup that investment and profit. Here's where my controversial lens comes in. I sometimes wonder whether our healthcare system naturally creates stronger financial incentives to develop treatments that people take for years, rather than one-off treatments that could dramatically reduce the need for ongoing medication. I'm not saying that happens in every case, and I'm certainly not saying pharmaceutical companies don't develop life-changing medication, because they absolutely do. But modern biologics have transformed lives of millions of people, myself included. But how much does the economics of drug development influence the kind of treatments that ultimately make it to market? Because science doesn't happen in a vacuum. Research needs funding, clinical trials need funding, and if no one is willing to invest, promising ideas can struggle to generate the evidence needed to become licensed medicine. That doesn't mean peptides are the answer. And it doesn't mean there's a big conspiracy. And just so nobody misunderstands me, I'm not talking about some huge conspiracy. I'm talking about incentives. Let's use BPC 157 as an example. One of the reasons it's generated so much interest is because researchers are investigating whether it could support tissue repair, particularly within the GI tract. Now, imagine for a moment that future high quality human trials showed it could genuinely repair damaged gut tissue and change the course of disease. That would be fundamentally different from reducing symptoms. It wouldn't just be masking pain or suppressing inflammation for a short period. It would be targeting the underlying damage itself. And if you can genuinely repair damaged tissue, the question naturally becomes, once that tissue is repaired, do you need ongoing treatment in the same way? That's a very different model of medicine. Now, to be absolutely clear, we are not there yet. We don't have the evidence to say BPC 157 does that in humans, and that's exactly why more research is needed. But that's the question I find particularly fascinating. Should medicine always be asking, can we manage the disease better? Or should we also be asking whether we can actually change the disease itself? The future of peptides. Where do I think peptides go from here? Personally, I don't think they're going anywhere. In fact, I think we're only really scratching the surface. Over the next decade or two, I think we'll see more peptide-based medicines entering mainstream healthcare. Some will become licensed treatments, some will fail during development. Take CJC 1295 as an example. It generated a huge amount of excitement because of its ability to stimulate your growth hormone release. Early research showed promising biological effects. Despite that promise, it never went on to becoming a licensed medicine. Yet, if you spent any time in bodybuilding circles, you will still find people raving about it and taking it today. And early research showed that it did exactly what research expected. It increased growth hormone and IGF-1 levels. But showing a biological effect is only one piece of the puzzle. It still has to prove it's safe, clinically useful and worthwhile compared with existing treatments before it ever becomes a licensed medicine. That never happened with CJC 1295, and development was eventually discontinued. Yet if you spend any time in bodybuilding circles, you'll still find so many people using it today. Another interesting challenge is that performance is incredibly difficult to study. Let's say someone builds 5 kilograms of muscle while using a peptide. Was it the peptide? Or was it the fact that they trained 6 days a week, tracked every calorie, hit their protein target every day, slept 8 hours a night, and followed a structured program for months? Unlike treating a disease where you can often measure a specific outcome, physique and performance are influenced by dozens of variables all working together. Researchers do their best to control those factors, but it's incredibly difficult to completely separate the effect of a peptide from everything else an athlete is doing. And this also perfectly highlights the difference between bodybuilding culture and evidence-based research. Bodybuilders have always historically been early adopters. They're often willing to experiment with compounds long before the science is settled. Sometimes they're ahead of the research. Sometimes those compounds eventually become valuable medicines, and sometimes they never do, like in the case of CJC 1295. Does that mean it's not effective in those circles? No, but it means within its constraints within scientific research, it wasn't successful. Others won't live up to the hype, and that's exactly how science is supposed to work. So it's really important to remember that just because a peptide doesn't become a licensed medicine doesn't automatically mean it doesn't have value. It may still have biological effects or potential applications that are useful in certain contexts, such as sports performance or bodybuilding. The problem is that without the robust evidence, we can't confidently separate genuine benefit from placebo, training, nutrition, genetics, or other factors. That's why research matters, not because it's trying to prove that peptides don't work, but because it's trying to understand who they work for, how they work, whether it's safe, and whether the benefits outweighs the risks. So are peptides the new fad? No, I think the hype is. Peptides themselves aren't new. Scientists have been researching them for decades. And some peptide-based medicines are already changing lives every single day. Others still remain experimental. Some will definitely go on to become some breakthrough treatments. Others might not make it beyond the research stage. And that's exactly how science is supposed to work. We ask the questions, we test the ideas, we challenge assumptions, and we follow the evidence wherever it leads. If you've listened to this whole episode, I hope one thing has become clear. I'm not anti-peptide. I'm not pro-peptide. I'm pro-evidence. I think peptides represent one of the more exciting areas of modern medicine. But I also think social media's done what social media always does. It's taken a very complex scientific topic and turned it on its head. My advice is simple. Be curious, ask questions, read beyond the headlines. Don't let TikTok become your medical textbook. And don't mistake somebody's transformation or even somebody's personal story, including mine, for scientific proof. As a coach, people often ask me whether I recommend peptides. The answer is still no. My coaching has always been built on the fundamentals that we know work. Progressive training, good nutrition, adequate protein, quality sleep, stress management, consistency over months and years, and working with your female physiology rather than against it. Those are still the foundations of health and body composition. And I don't think any peptide will ever replace them. If years from now the evidence changes and the new peptides therapies become safe, well researched, and widely available, then that is fantastic. Science should evolve, our opinions should evolve with it. But until then, I think the best approach is to stay open-minded without becoming gullible. Be excited by the possibilities, respect the science, question the hype. And remember that the goal has never been to chase the newest compound. The goal is to build a healthier, stronger body and make informed decisions based on the evidence we do have. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who might find it helpful. And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.